In this video, we're going to discuss the use of layers in the Vectric software. I'm going to start with a short slideshow to explain what layers are, the types of data that you can put onto layers, some of their main uses, some key facts about them, and the ways that layers are created. Then after we've run through those, we're going to go into the software itself and look at some of these things in action. First off, we should discuss what layers actually are. Essentially, they're a system that lets you organise your data when you're creating a CAD design. That could be in 2D or 3D. Really what they're going to do is help you manage the 2D entities that you've got within the software. So what entities can you put on a layer? As I said, these are all going to be 2D objects. Specifically and mainly you'll be working with vectors on layers. You can also put bitmaps onto layers, that's images that you import into the software. When you create dimensions, they'll be assigned to a layer. And if you're working with Aspire and you're creating 3D components, then the grayscale previews for those components that you see in the 2D view will also be assigned to a layer as well. So what are the main uses for layers? How do they help me keep my data organised? One of the key things you can do with a layer is to hide the objects on it. You can basically go into your layer manager, switch that layer's visibility off, and then everything that's assigned to that layer will be undrawn. So it just helps you to simplify the data you're looking at in the 2D view as you work with more and more complex designs. Another way you can use the layers to help you differentiate between different types of objects is to assign colour to a layer. When you assign a colour to a layer, all the vectors that are on that layer will be displayed with that colour that you've chosen. So again, it's just a nice way to help you differentiate between different vectors that are on different layers. Another way to use the layers is to give them a name that relates to the type of object that are on them. This is purely to help you organise your work. The name is not relevant to what actually happens to that, but just a way where you're going to be able to recognise it. Maybe it'll remind you what type of toolpath you wanted to create for the vectors on that layer, or maybe it would remind you of how it relates to your design overall, perhaps as a part of the component or assembly. Another more specialised but powerful use of layers is the ability for the software to associate a toolpath with data across a single or multiple layers. What this allows you to do is within the toolpath form use what's called the vector selector. When you go into there, it gives you the option to say what type of data and what layers you'd like to associate that toolpath with. This can then be recalculated on other designs to apply the same toolpath to geometry which exists on the same layers and with those same parameters. There is a tutorial that covers this specifically, G03, so I'd recommend looking at that if you're interested in that process. To understand how the layer management works, it's important to know that an object can only be on one layer at any specific moment. When we create a new object, that will automatically be placed on the current active layer. Active layer, as shown in the image that we have on the screen here, is the one called drill holes. You can see that the piece of paper in this column is more visible than the ones that are greyed out above it, and also the text for the name of the layer is bold, so that indicates that's the active layer. If I was to create a vector, then that's the layer that it will be placed on. Most editing operations will not change the current layer of an object. For instance, if I was to take a vector, move it or resize it, it will stay on the layer that it's currently assigned to. However, if the operation I'm doing to edit the vector is actually creating a new object, for example if I'm offsetting a vector, then that will be placed onto the active layer. So even if I was to take a vector, offset it and delete the original, so it would appear that I'd in effect edited the one I had, that operation actually creates a new vector and therefore it's placed on the active layer. It's useful to learn which functions will put you in that situation so that you can make sure that you've got the right layer selected at that point. 2D toolpath previews, although they're visible in the 2D view, are not assigned to a layer. They're a special type of data and they're only associated with the toolpath so that you can switch their visibility on and off by toggling the toolpath's visibility. It's useful to understand how layers get created within the software. The first and most obvious is clicking on the button in the Layer Manager that says Add New Layer. That will simply add a layer into the list with a default name and then give you the option to type in a name of your own. Another way the user might specifically request a new layer is to use the right mouse click context menu and choose the option either to copy to layer or move to layer. When you click on either of those, it'll show you a list of the current layers that you could choose from, or it'll give the option to create a new layer and again then allow you to type in a name for that layer. Some layers are created and named automatically. For instance, when we import an image into the software, perhaps to trace a bitmap to put a vector on it, the software will automatically create a layer which is called bitmap layer and place that at the top of the layer manager. Now, although it's possible for me to move that bitmap onto other layers or to rename that layer, generally speaking it's good practice to leave that as is, because then you'll always know that the data on there consists of that image and it's easy to switch off or switch on again depending how you want to use it. Another way that you automatically create and name layers is by importing a vector file. When you import a DXF or a DWG file, that may have been created in the original software program that it was drawn in with a set of layers already assigned to it. If so, and if those layers were saved in the file, then when you import it into the software, we'll recreate those layers with the same names in the layer manager, and the objects that were on those layers will also be the same as it was saved originally. For a PDF document, when we import vectors from it, if there are multiple pages, then the software will create a different layer for each page and name those accordingly. If there's just a single page, then it will just give the layer the same name as the file you're importing. And that's the same when you do it with an EPS or an AI vector file as well. When you import those, it doesn't have the layer information built into it, it'll just create a single layer that's named after the imported file. When we create dimensions in the software, we have the option to check a box to place dimensions on a layer, and we can give that a name. By default it's called dimensions, and again, much like the bitmap, because that's a specific type of information and can only be used in a certain way in the software, it's normally a good idea to keep that on a specific layer so that it's easy to switch that on and off as you want to use it. Finally, there's a couple of specialist functions, the plate production, and also within Aspire the create zero plane function that will create a set of layers or a specific layer to put that data on. If you're new to drawing, design, or as it's typically referred to, CAD software, then you may find the idea of layers quite confusing. They are reasonably abstract because there isn't a good analogy that allows you to explain how they would be used outside of a computer. They are incredibly important though, so we'll just take a moment to discuss the use of layers before we move on and show you some of the ideas that we've discussed in the software itself. A common question when you first start to think about layers is what's the best way to use them? Unfortunately, there's no right or wrong way to use layers, so nobody can specifically say to you this is the best way to use layers. Essentially what you need to do is learn how they work and then think how that will suit your application and, more importantly, the way you like to keep your work organised. Next question is, do you have to use layers at all? Certainly you don't have to use layers, but what you're going to find once you start to create designs and try and keep them organised is even simple projects will benefit from using them. Apart from some of the automated functions that you can do with layers, just naming things so that you can go back to the list and see the type of data that's on there, easily switch things off and on, is really going to be helpful as you start to create designs. One thing that is useful is that throughout the tutorials you'll see layers are used extensively, so that you can see different ways that they can be used and set up, and we're going to cover all the key areas that people might use layers for to keep their data organised when they're working on their 2D and 3D designs in the different software programs. Let's go ahead now and start a copy of the software so that we can examine some of the ideas that we've looked at here actually in the program itself. So we'll start just by creating a blank job. I'm going to make this 12 by 12 and just enter some arbitrary values here. Z0 top of the block, thickness 1. We'll work with the date and position in the center of the part in inches. Hit the OK button. You can see when the software first opens here that there's a section on the drawing tab which has got the title layer. Next to that is this menu. If I click on the arrow here, this will drop down and it will show me the layer manager. As well as accessing it from the drawing tab here, if we just hit close, we also have a tab at the bottom. So if I click where it says layers here at the bottom, then that opens a complete tab which has my layer manager on it as well. Essentially the same information will be repeated in both those locations. So whether I look at it on the drawing tab and click on the arrow, or whether I look on the layers tab itself, I'm going to see the same set of layers listed here. Another way to access the full layer manager here, if you're on the drawing tab say, or maybe in Aspire you're on the modeling tab, or you're across on the toolpaths tab, is the shortcut key, and that's holding down Control on the keyboard, and then at the same time you're holding that, pressing L. When you do that, you can see that it automatically opens the layer manager for me on whatever tab I happen to currently be on. Now I can see that when I create a new job, as we've done here, I'm going to have a single layer automatically created in the list, which is called layer 1. I have to have at least one layer in the part. I could not come up here and delete this last layer now, because otherwise there would be no layer for me to place items on when I created a new object. There are various edits we can make to a layer. In this case we could come in here, and if I knew what I was going to draw on it, then maybe I'd change its name before I started creating any vectors. To change the layer name, we can either click on it, you'll see it becomes highlighted, and then I could type in a new name for it, and then just click anywhere in the blank space of the layer menu to accept that. Another way we could access that rename option is to come up and click on the list here, and you can see all the options I've got for a layer at any moment in time will be displayed here. So if I click on that and choose the option to rename, then it does the same thing as well. Again, if I'm happy with that name, I can just click to keep it. Now if we come back to the drawing tab and I create a vector, so if I come up here, click on the icon here to draw a rectangle, and let's enter in a value of 10 by 10, hit create and close, that has automatically been placed on my current active layer. At the moment, if we look at the layer list, I only have one layer, so it's only possible that that layer could be the active one. It's shown as being active because the text is bold and this icon here is quite visible. Now it's possible for me to undraw this layer so that the item on it is not displayed. If I click on the light bulb here in the list, then it undraws it. You'll also notice that the text turns red. What that's indicating to me is that this is the active layer, but that I have it currently undrawn. Generally speaking, you're going to want your active layer to be visible in almost all situations. So the red text is a bit of a warning to say at this point you may want to switch that layer back on, or you might want to choose another layer in the list if you have one. So as I mentioned before, we have the main layer manager here, but we also have this drop down layer manager on the drawing tab. And most of the operations that you can do on the layer manager are available to here, and it's often more convenient to access it without having to go onto the layer manager itself. The main thing you can't do in this list is change the order of the layers. For that you have to go onto the layer manager and use the arrows to move them up and down. What we could do in here, for instance, though, is click on the drop down arrow, come into here, click on the list, and then click on the option to rename. And it's worth again reiterating the fact that the name that you assign to a layer has nothing to do with what's on it. So I could actually give this layer any name I want, totally unrelated. It's just purely my personal preference as to what we're going to call the object on this layer. It may be that I call it border vector as I had before, maybe that I call it fish if that was somehow relevant. It's unlikely to be, or it may be that we change the way we're thinking about this vector for the job we're working on, and we might call it profile cutout. So again, it's just any name that you give it is purely down to how you're going to make sense of it and understand it. It doesn't matter to the software what we enter into here. That's a very important concept to understand. So let's look at creating a new layer now. If I want to do that, I can click on the down arrow. From within the layer manager, we've got this button, add new layer. It'll automatically add a layer at the bottom of the list, and you can see the names highlighted, so I can enter a name of my own choosing. If I just click to close this, it would take the default name. It's very easy to get in the habit of just using the default names, but if you can get into the discipline of assigning a layer a name that makes sense to you, you will find that you keep your work much better organized. So in this case, let's go ahead and enter the name star in here. Then we can just click in the background to accept that, and you'll notice that that layer is now bold. The text for the layer name is now bold, which shows me that that is the active layer. Another way to tell that is if I close this, you can see the active layer name is displayed here on the drop down bar where we access the layer manager. So now any new objects that I create will automatically be placed on this layer called star. So in this case, I've given it that name in anticipation of the fact that I was planning to draw a star next. So I'm going to click on the star object here. Let's say we want a 5-pointed star. I'm going to make this 3-inch radius, and I'm going to use this percentage 38.2, which is going to give me very close to being what we'd sort of consider the standard shape for a very typical star. Now, how do I know that's on that layer? There's no real indication other than the fact that's selected there, although if I select an object, you'll see that at the very bottom of the interface here it displays the width and the height of that object, and also displays the layer name for that object too. So that's quite a useful way to interrogate to see what layer an object might be on without maybe going into the layer manager itself and starting to switch the layers on and off to see what disappears when you do that. So as well as renaming, let's look at some of the other things we can do to a layer. Again, we can use the drop-down version here on the Drawing tab. Same options would be available from the main layer tab itself. First thing we've looked at, we can rename, we can switch the visibility of the object on and off, and then this box here, where you see this black box with the arrow underneath it, allows us to control the color of all the vectors on that layer. So if I want to, I can click on the down arrow. We can see the color palette here. I can choose from the main set of colors, or I can click to access more colors. But if I choose one of these, for instance, let's choose the green in this case, you can see that that's changed color. Maybe the green is not the clearest of colors to differentiate, so maybe we'll choose the orange there, and that's a little bit more obvious. Now the colours that you choose are purely personal preference, so again it's really just a case of choosing colours that you can easily differentiate and that make sense to you with the way that you're trying to organise your data. Something else we can do to a layer is to lock it. If I click on the drop down arrow here, come to the star layer, we'll click on the list and choose the option to lock. You can see that the visibility icon changes here so that it's got this little padlock next to it. And what this means now, if I close that, is I can no longer select that object. So for instance, if you're working with construction data, or maybe you've created some vectors, you want to make sure you don't accidentally select them or move them or do anything else to them, then you can lock that layer. The layer still allows you to see what's on it, so you might be able to use that as a reference, but you won't be able to edit it until you go back into the layer manager, click on the list here and choose the option to unlock. Now again, we could select that vector and go ahead and edit it, manipulate it, change its size, rotate it, etc. So at this stage we might create another new vector. So let's click on the draw circle icon here. I'm going to enter a center point which is at x0 and y4, and we'll put in a diameter of 1/2 inch and hit create and close. Now you'll see that our current active layer is the one that we just created called star. We'd assigned the color orange to that, and so now this new vector we've created has been created on my active layer and is also displayed in that same color because both the circle and the star exist on that layer called star. Now at this stage I may realize that I didn't want to create those on the same layer, or later on in my design process I may just choose that I'd like to move something or copy something onto a different layer. To do that, I would select the object, right mouse click, and then at the very bottom here you're going to see we have the option to copy to layer or move to layer. In this case, let's assume that we've incorrectly created that on the layer called star, so we'd like to move it to a different layer. In this case, I have the choice of the layers that we've already created, so I could choose either of those to move that onto, or I can click on the option to create a new layer. If I do that, the software will show me the box here. I can enter a name for that, so I'm going to call this circles, and again I could choose a specific color for that layer if I wanted to, so maybe we'll pick blue, and I have the option here to make this visible and also to make it the active layer. In some cases you might be moving data onto another layer but want to temporarily undraw it. Perhaps you're going to come back to it later, or maybe you're making a safe copy of it while you continue to edit the original set of vectors. In that case, we'd uncheck both of these and hit OK, and if we did that, we'd see the object disappear. In my case, what I'd like to do is make that layer that we're creating both visible and automatically make it the active layer. So when I hit OK here, you should see the name that we've got up here change to the layer that we're creating because we've asked the software to make it active. So if I click OK, we can see that name's changed up there. So now my currently active layer is this one called circles. If I click on the drop down, we can see there that that is the one that's shown in bold. Now we're going to take that circle we've created there, and let's do an array. Let's click on the icon to create a circular array. I'm going to choose a rotation center of 0, 0. Check the box to rotate copies. I'm going to put 20 objects around the total 360-degree circle. You'll see one of the options I've got in here is grouping the vectors together that we create around our array. If I just check that for a moment and hit copy, you can see when I close this that that effectively is going to act like a single object. If I click it, you can see it selects all those objects. And that's what happens when I assign something into a group. The software is going to treat that as if it was a single object for the purpose of editing. If I was to take that and resize it, it will size all those objects, acting on them as if they were one thing. Now you'll notice that all these circles are blue, and that's because my current active layer circles is blue, and so when we did that array command there, effectively that group we've created, which is a whole bunch of single vectors that have been grouped together by the software, has been created on that layer. So that group as a whole exists on that one layer. It would certainly be possible for me to ungroup it and assign these circles onto different layers if I wanted to. And we'll explore the idea of groups and layers a little bit more further along in this video. Last thing I'd like to look at here is what happens when we use an existing vector to create a new one. If I select our square here, and we know that square is on the profile cutout layer, if you remember that, we can see that down the bottom of the interface here. If I take this and click on the offset selected vectors command, let's tell the software that we want to offset that inwards, and in this case maybe we'll just go 1/4 of an inch, sharp corners, hit offset and close. If I deselect that just by clicking here, you can see that my new vector is blue. Now that's because our active layer is this one called circles here, which has the blue color associated with it. And so even though the original vector we used to offset was on a different layer, because this is creating a new vector, the new vector will always be placed onto the current active layer. If we wanted to, of course, we could take that, select it, right mouse click, move to layer and move it to the profile cutout layer if that's where we'd actually wanted to create that vector in the first place. Note that moving that vector has not changed the current active layer though. I would still continue to work on the circles layer if I was to draw additional vectors within this design. I'm just going to save this file now, go File, Save As, and in the project folder we'll call this Layer Example 1, and that's just there in case you want to open this and take a look at it, but you should be able to recreate this quite easily. Before we do close this file, I would like to show you one exception to a rule that I mentioned earlier, whereby when we create a new vector, it's always put onto the current active layer. When we make a copy of a vector, there's two ways to do it. One is to select the object, right mouse click, choose copy from the copy menu, or we could use Ctrl+C on the keyboard, And then if we right mouse click and paste that, that will paste a copy of that vector, so the same vector, but you can see it's turned blue, and that's because my current active layer is the circles layer, which is blue. If I click on that, I can drag that out the way. We can see that there. We can see our original orange one, and there's the blue one that we created. Now, another way of copying an object though is not to use the right mouse click copy or the Control C copy, which puts the object onto the clipboard and then allows me to paste it. It's to select the object and hold the Control key down on the keyboard, and then to use any of the transform modes. So I could click and drag to create a new copy, or I could go ahead and shrink it or something like that. What we're going to see when I deselect this though is it is orange, and that shows me, if I select it, and we'll see at the bottom here that it's on the star layer, the same as the object that I copied. So just a subtle difference there. If I right mouse click or Control C copy and paste, then it will go on the active layer. If I hold the Control key down and drag to make a copy, then that's going to keep the new object on the original object's layer. And that's just, although not following the same logic, that's just typically what most people are expecting to happen when they make one of those two types of copies. Now, before we close this file down, I would like to look at a couple more things. One is an exception to the rule that I mentioned earlier, whereby when we create a new vector, it will always go onto the current active layer. When we copy an object, for instance, if I was to select the star here, right mouse click, and from the drop down menu choose copy, or as you can see the shortcut key for that would be Control C. And then if I was to right mouse click in here and choose paste, you can see if I deselect that I've got a new star, but it's coloured blue. And the blue is because my current active layer is this one called circles that has the blue colour associated with it. If I click on this, click on it again to go into transform mode, I could drag it out the way. You can see there's my blue star, there's my original orange star still on the layer called star. Now that is the sort of behaviour that I described earlier. If I delete that though, another way that we have to copy an object is to hold the Control key down when I'm transforming it, for instance when I'm moving it or when I'm adjusting its size. So if I click on the star here, click on it again to go into transform mode, hold Control down on the keyboard, click in the centre and drag to make a new star. When I deselect this, you'll see that it is still orange, and if I click on it, we can see at the bottom here it's still on the layer called star. And that's the exception to the rule. When we use the copy option by holding the Control key down when we transform it, that will keep the vector on the layer of the original object that I copied. Let's just delete that extra star now. And although the logic differs between those two methods, you can see that the idea of right mouse clicking, copying something and pasting a new object is conceptually a little different than just clicking and dragging it, and that's why that behaviour is different. So we've seen a selection of methods for creating new layers, and it is also possible to delete layers as well. If I click on the down arrow here, we can come down to the layer here called circles. I can click on the list and I can choose the option to delete. If there's data on the layer, then it's going to give me two choices. One of those is to move that data onto a different layer, so it'll still delete the layer, but we'll still have retained the data. Or we can say that we want to not only delete the layer, we'd like to delete everything that's on it by choosing the option to delete data. In this case, let's say with the circles that we'd actually like to move those onto the layer called Profile Cutout and hit OK. Now you can see that they've changed so that they're now black. And also my active layer has changed because that circles layer is no longer available. We just deleted it, so that couldn't possibly be my active layer anymore. You can see if we went ahead, click on the down arrow, go to the star layer, click on the list, choose delete and choose the delete data option and hit OK, then not only will that layer now no longer be in the list, but also the vectors or any other 2D object that was on that layer would have been deleted as well. So I'm going to close this file now, and then we'll look at a couple more things just before we finish this presentation. Go up to File, Close. I'm not going to save this. I'm going to click on the option to create a new file and just take the same values that we had for the first example and hit OK. What I'd like to do now is show you what happens when you import an image into the software. If we click on the layers drop down, we can see that, as we would expect by creating a new file, we've got one layer called layer 1 that currently has nothing on it. If I close this, come up to the icon to import bitmap for tracing, I've copied an image into the project folder. This is actually an image used in one of the other tutorials, just so we can use this as an example. I'm going to click on the open button, and we can see that's imported in, it's displayed in the 2D view. My layers don't appear to have changed. I've still got the same active layer selected here, layer 1, but if we look at the layers tab, we can see that the software has automatically created a new layer and it's named this bitmap layer. If I click on the light bulb in order to switch that off and then on again, you can see that that image we've imported has been placed on this layer that's been automatically generated. And if I was to import additional images, they'd also be placed on that layer as well. Now it is possible for me to rename that, reorder it, even to draw vectors on that layer. It's not a special layer, it's just something that the software creates to make it a little bit easier to keep things organized as you import them. And generally speaking, we'd advise that you keep all the images on the bitmap layer and don't create vectors on that layer. So generally speaking, you're rarely going to select that to be your active layer. Now, something else to note here that's displayed in the layer manager is whether a layer has data on it or not. We can see the bitmap layer has something on it, and so it's displayed this piece of paper here as having a rectangle and a circle, whereas layer 1 currently has nothing on it, so that is shown as being blank. If I come into the drawing tab and I was to, say, sketch a polyline here, that's going to be on the active layer, which is going to be that layer called layer 1. So if I hit close now and look at the layer manager, we can see that both the bitmap layer has the data on it and layer 1 does, but if I was to create another new layer, then that will be shown as not having any data on it. So whether this piece of paper here is displaying something on it or is blank is a really nice quick visual indicator as to whether that layer actually contains any data or not. Something else that's worth mentioning with the layer manager is, like all the other tabs, it's possible to click on the top part of it here where it says layers and to drag this and to move it so that it is a floating window. This can be resized and moved around different places on the screen. You could even have it outside of the interface if you wanted. I'm going to just drag this back over and lock that back into place by putting it back into the same position. You can see we're back to our normal layout again. So that's just something if you want to customize the way that you have these, or maybe you want to keep the layer manager available to you even when you're working on other tabs. Really, that does require you to have reasonable screen real estate though, so maybe you'd be working on dual monitors if you're going to do that. So let's look at one last example here where we can see more about how the layers can interact with grouped vectors. So File, Close, not going to save the changes to that. I'm going to create another new file. This time I'm going to make it 24 by 24, hit OK. And what I'm going to do is import some vectors. So again, if we look, our default layer set up here is just a single layer called layer 1 with nothing on it. We generate a new file. I'm going to click on the icon to import vectors from a file. And I'm going to import this file called widgetexample.dxf. And again, this is actually some data from another one of the tutorials. I'm going to hit open. We can see that's imported apart here. If we look at our layers, we can see that that file, that DXF file, was created with a number of layers already in it. And those layers also had colors associated with them. So if we deselect these, we can see that each of these layers and the objects that are on it based on the colors that are selected for them. So at this point, I can see by looking at the piece of paper icons here that 4 of these layers have something on them and 2 of them don't. Quite often in a DXF file there's a layer called 0. Also, we had our default layer, layer 1 here. Neither of those have got anything on them, so it'd probably be beneficial for me, in order to keep my work organized, to delete those. Now I could easily right mouse click and choose the delete option to get rid of those. Another way that you can get rid of layers, or that you can merge data from multiple layers onto one, is to use the merge visible option, which is available under here. The way this works is it's going to merge together everything that is currently drawn in effect. So I would want to undraw the ones that I don't want to merge, so I'm going to undraw these three layers. I'm going to select the outline shape layer here, and what I'm going to tell the software, I'm going to right mouse click over the list icon for that layer and choose merge visible. And what that will do is take all the layers that are currently drawn, all the layers that currently have the light bulb illuminated, and it will merge those data onto that one layer that I've right mouse clicked on. So in this case I'm going to say merge visible, and all the data that was on those other layers would have been put onto the outline shape layer. In this case there was no data on them, so it didn't matter. All it's done is just deleted those and kind of cleaned up my list here. So let's just switch on the visibility for those other layers again. Then finally here, let's go back and discuss this idea of grouping once more. Earlier on we talked about the fact that we can organise things into groups. When things are on different layers they remain as individual objects, but if I was to take everything I've got in the design here and I was to right mouse click and choose the option to group objects from the context menu, if I deselect that we can see everything has turned green. And that's because when I grouped it, my active layer is this one called outline shape here. So at the moment I have a single group, I don't have separate vectors. When I click on it, it selects as one object, and that group is on the outline shape layer. So technically speaking, there's no other data on these other layers, and that's why the icon here is showing up as being blank. So now of course I can click on this and manipulate it in a number of ways, as I can with a regular vector, although this is a group, so we can drag it around, move it to a new position. We could even come to the drawing tab, set the selected object size, and maybe say we want to have a part which is 25% bigger, apply and close. We even might want to take our grouped object and make multiple copies of it. If we take this, click on the icon to create a linear array. Here I'm going to say 2 columns in Y, 2 columns in X. I'm going to offset these by 12 in X and 12 in Y and hit copy. So there we've created 4 copies. Each one of those is a separate group. You can see that all those groups are on the current active layer at the moment. This is the one that we've got coloured green. But at some point I may want to ungroup these again, particularly when I get to the point where I might want to start calculating toolpaths on the different pieces of data within these groups. And at that point it's not going to be very helpful to me to have them all on the same layer. It's going to make it much harder for me to select these, especially as they were previously organised. So a nice thing that the software does to help me with this issue is that when I create a group, it remembers the layers that the objects were originally on. So if I was now to come in and drag a box to select these 4 different groups that we've got here, right mouse click on here, choose the option to ungroup objects, you can see I have 2 choices. I can ungroup them onto the groups layer so that all those objects will be on a single layer, or I can say ungroup back onto original object layers. If I click on that and then I click to deselect, you can see that we're back to the original colours, and if we come over and click in order to undraw the different layers here, you can see how, even though we've made multiple copies of this and changed its size, the software remembered the layers that those vectors were on, and now they're back on those original layers, which would make it much easier for me if I was to start to want to assign toolpaths to these again. So just before we summarise and finish, I would like to show you one more way that you can create a layer. If we come down to the drawing tab, I'm going to come up and click on the icon to add dimensions to the 2D drawing. You can see at the bottom of this form we have the option to check to place dimensions on a layer. Generally speaking, because the dimensions are a sort of special sort of entity within the software, it's normally good to keep them on one layer. You can change the name for this. The default is dimensions, but we could put in anything we wanted here. And what that means is when I do create a dimension, so let's say we choose the arc dimension, and maybe we'll change the height of the text there, click on that arc, click here, maybe we'll click that arc there, putting the value there. So wherever I want to enter these dimensions on here, I can. And what the software will have done is automatically generate a new layer based on this information here. So if we close this, go to the Layers tab, we can see there's this new layer called Dimensions, which I can switch on and off and change color and do all the things that I can normally do to a layer to affect those objects that we've created on there. So again, just another nice way that the layers can be utilized to help keep your work organized. So that does conclude our video on layer management within the Vectric software. You've seen how useful and flexible the layers are. As you work through the other tutorials, take a note of how those layers are being used for different organisational approaches and see how you can start to use them in your own work if you're not making use of them already. One note on this presentation is we haven't shown how in Aspire the grayscale previews that are used to represent the 3D models in the 2D view work with the layers. As you work through the modelling tutorials for Aspire though, you will see that process demonstrated and you will see how you can assign a grayscale preview to a layer in the same way that we can assign a vector or an image to a layer as well. And that concludes this video.